The fluorescent lights of the courtroom hummed, their monotonous drone a stark contrast to the electric tension that permeated the air. The faint scent of lemon polish, usually a comforting smell, felt oddly sterile and unsettling in this context. Judge Thomas Thompson, a man whose 62 years had been largely defined by the oak-paneled walls and hushed pronouncements of this very courtroom, adjusted his bifocal glasses, peering down at the defendant with an expression that was both weary and intensely focused. Robert Miller, a man on the precipice of ruin, stood before him. Miller, once the golden boy of Silicon Valley, the CEO of Innovatech, a company that had, until recently, been the darling of Wall Street, now looked like a wilted flower. His usually impeccable navy suit hung loosely on his frame, the fine Italian wool unable to disguise the nervous tremor that pulsed through his hands. He subtly shifted his weight from one foot to the other, a telltale sign of the anxiety that gnawed at him. His lawyer, Sarah Chen, stood beside him, a picture of controlled composure. Chen, a legal legend known for her ice-cold demeanor and razor-sharp intellect, was rumored to command fees that could bankrupt a small nation. She whispered words of encouragement to Miller, her voice a low, sibilant hiss that barely reached the first row of the gallery. It was a practice performance, a subtle reassurance meant as much for the jury as for her client. Chen knew that every detail mattered, every whispered word, every fleeting expression could sway the balance of justice. The gallery was a sea of faces, a microcosm of the city itself. Journalists, their faces etched with a mixture of professional detachment and barely concealed excitement, scribbled furiously in their notepads. The rhythmic scratching of pens on paper was a surprisingly loud counterpoint to the otherwise oppressive silence. Representatives from Novatech, the rival company that had accused Miller of stealing their proprietary technology, sat rigidly in the second row, their expressions a carefully cultivated mask of righteous indignation. Among them was Amanda Chen, no relation to Sarah, Novatech's fiercely ambitious head of R&D, a woman who had personally overseen the development of the technology in question. She had been a constant presence throughout the trial, her gaze never leaving Miller, a silent accusation burning in her eyes. Further back sat Miller's family. His wife, Eleanor, a woman whose porcelain beauty seemed to have cracked under the strain of the past few months, their two teenage children, looking lost and confused, and his elderly mother, her frail hands clutching a rosary, her lips moving in silent prayer. Their presence was a stark reminder of the human cost of this legal battle, the lives that would be irrevocably altered by the jury's verdict. Interspersed among them were curious onlookers, drawn by the high-profile nature of the case, and a smattering of law students, eager to witness a masterclass in courtroom strategy from Sarah Chen. The air itself seemed to vibrate with unspoken anxieties and expectations. This trial wasn't simply about corporate espionage. It was a clash of titans, a modern-day David and Goliath story, albeit with both sides wielding considerable power and influence. It was a reflection of the cutthroat world of Silicon Valley, where innovation and ambition often blurred the lines between ethical conduct and outright criminality. The case had captivated the nation. dominating headlines and fueling endless speculation on social media. Miller's defense had been a masterpiece of legal maneuvering. Chen had built a wall of reasonable doubt, brick by painstaking brick. She had systematically chipped away at the prosecution's case, exposing inconsistencies in witness testimonies, highlighting the circumstantial nature of much of the evidence, and subtly suggesting that Miller was a victim of corporate sabotage, a pawn in a much larger game orchestrated by forces within Novatech itself. She'd even managed to call into question the reliability of Novatech's security protocols, implying that the leak could have originated from within their own ranks, a carefully planted seed of doubt designed to take root in the jurors' minds. She had presented expert witnesses who testified to the inherent difficulties in definitively tracing the source of digital information, further muddying the waters. The prosecution, led by the ambitious and fiery district attorney, David Ramirez, had fought back with equal ferocity. Ramirez, a man known for his theatrical courtroom style and his relentless pursuit of justice, had presented a compelling narrative of greed and betrayal. He paraded a stream of witnesses before the jury, each one adding another layer to the portrait of Miller as a calculating, ruthless executive willing to sacrifice anything on the altar of personal gain. Former Novatech employees, disgruntled and eager to settle scores, had testified to Miller's demanding and often unethical management style. Digital forensic experts had presented complex data analyses, claiming to definitively link Miller to the stolen files. Ramirez had even introduced evidence of Miller's lavish spending habits, suggesting that he was living beyond his means and desperately needed a financial windfall to maintain his lifestyle. Today was the culmination of weeks of intense legal battle. Judge Thompson had already delivered his instructions to the jury, a lengthy and labyrinthine explanation of the relevant laws, full of legal jargon and complex precedents. The instructions, designed to clarify the legal framework for the jury's deliberations, had, ironically, left many in the gallery, including some seasoned legal observers, feeling more confused than ever. The sheer weight of their responsibility, the power to decide Robert Miller's fate, hung heavy in the air, a palpable presence. Ramirez had just concluded his closing statement, a passionate and dramatic plea for justice. He had painted a vivid picture of Miller as a corporate pirate, a thief who had stolen the intellectual property of a rival company to enrich himself. He had reminded the jury of the evidence, the witness testimonies, the digital trail that he argued irrefutably pointed to Miller's guilt. His voice had risen to a crescendo as he delivered his final, damning words. And therefore, members of the jury, I implore you, find the defendant, Robert Miller, guilty on all counts of corporate espionage. He sat down, his face flushed, his chest heaving slightly with the exertion. He locked eyes with the jury, a silent challenge in his gaze. A ripple of murmurs spread through the gallery, a collective intake of breath, a recognition of the gravity of the moment. It was now Sarah Chen's turn. The fate of her client and her own formidable reputation rested on her ability to persuade the jury. She rose slowly, her movements deliberate and graceful, her tailored suit a stark contrast to Miller's rumpled attire. She exuded an aura of calm confidence, a silent assurance that radiated outwards, captivating the attention of everyone in the room. Her eyes, sharp and intelligent, scanned the faces of the jurors, one by one making brief but intense eye contact with each of them. It was a technique she had perfected over years of practice, a way of establishing a personal connection, of making each juror feel seen and understood. "Members of the jury," she began, her voice soft but resonant, filling the silent courtroom. Her voice had a hypnotic quality, a soothing cadence that drew the listener in. "You have listened patiently to weeks of testimony. You have been presented with a mountain of evidence, much of it technical, much of it conflicting." She paused, allowing her words to hang in the air, to sink into the consciousness of the jurors. "The prosecution has attempted to portray Mr. Miller as a villain, a man driven by insatiable greed, a man who would stop at nothing to achieve his goals. But I ask you, is this portrayal fair? Is it complete?" She took a slow, deliberate step towards the jury box, her heels clicking softly on the polished wooden floor. The sound, usually insignificant, seemed amplified in the tense silence of the courtroom. "I submit to you that it is not. The prosecution's case is built on a precarious foundation of speculation, on assumptions and conjecture, on a narrative that conveniently overlooks crucial details, that ignores inconvenient truths." She began to systematically dismantle the prosecution's arguments, meticulously dissecting each piece of evidence, exposing its flaws and weaknesses. She spoke of the lack of direct, irrefutable evidence linking Miller to the theft. She highlighted the reliance on circumstantial proof, the potential for misinterpretation, the inherent biases in the witness testimonies. She reminded the jury of the fundamental principle of the American legal system, the presumption of innocence, the requirement that they be convinced of Miller's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. She emphasized the word reasonable, drawing it out, imbuing it with weight and significance. She masterfully weaved a counter-narrative, a story of corporate intrigue and internal sabotage, suggesting that Miller was not the perpetrator, but the victim, a scapegoat caught in a web of deceit spun by his rivals. She subtly alluded to the possibility of a disgruntled employee within Novatech, someone with access to the sensitive information and a motive to frame Miller. She didn't offer concrete proof, but she planted the seeds of doubt, allowing them to germinate in the fertile ground of the jurors' minds. It was a masterful display of legal strategy, a delicate dance between suggestion and innuendo. Suddenly, a disturbance erupted near the rear of the courtroom. A door, usually kept locked, leading to a small holding area for witnesses and individuals awaiting their turn to testify, creaked open with a jarring groan. A young woman, appearing to be in her early 20s, with a cascade of unruly red hair pulled back in a haphazard ponytail, and eyes that blazed with an unnerving intensity, stumbled into the room. She was dressed in a faded, oversized gray hoodie, emblazoned with the logo of a local band, and ripped jeans that had seen better days. Her attire was a stark and jarring contrast to the formal, almost somber, atmosphere of the courtroom. A collective gasp rippled through the gallery, a wave of startled whispers and murmurs. Everyone turned to stare at the unexpected intruder, their faces a mixture of confusion, curiosity, and annoyance. Judge Thompson, visibly irritated by the disruption, slammed his gavel down with a resounding thud. "Order! Order in this courtroom!" he thundered, his voice echoing through the high-ceilinged space. The sound reverberated, momentarily silencing the whispers. The young woman, seemingly oblivious to the judge's outburst and the stares of the onlookers, remained standing near the doorway, her gaze fixed intently on Robert Miller. He stared back at her, his face draining of color, his already pale complexion turning ashen. A flicker of recognition, followed by a wave of palpable fear, washed over his features. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Chen, who had been in the midst of her meticulously crafted closing argument, stopped mid-sentence, her eyes narrowing, her expression shifting from confusion to a dawning comprehension, a flicker of something that might have been alarm. The two courtroom security officers, burly men in dark blue uniforms, their faces impassive, moved towards the young woman with measured steps, intending to quietly escort her out of the courtroom and restore order. She raised a hand, palm open, in a gesture that was both defiant and strangely authoritative. The gesture, surprisingly, halted the officers in their tracks. There was something in her demeanor, in the unwavering intensity of her gaze, in the sheer unexpectedness of her presence, that commanded attention, that demanded to be heard. "Don't touch me," she said, her voice surprisingly strong and clear, cutting through the murmurs and whispers of the gallery like a knife through butter. Her voice resonated with a raw, untamed energy that contrasted sharply with the controlled, measured tones of the lawyers. She took a step forward, her eyes still locked on Miller, her gaze unwavering. "I have something to say, something important." Judge Thompson, his face now a mask of barely suppressed fury, leaned forward, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Young lady," he said, his words clipped and precise, "you are disrupting these proceedings. You are in contempt of court. Identify yourself immediately and state your purpose, or I will be forced to have you removed and you will face serious consequences." The young woman took another step, her gaze shifting momentarily from Miller to the jury, her eyes sweeping across their faces, as if assessing their receptiveness, their willingness to listen. The silence in the courtroom was now absolute, suffocating, pregnant with anticipation. Even the journalists, seasoned veterans of countless courtroom dramas, had ceased their frantic scribbling, their pens poised motionless above their notepads, their eyes glued to the young woman. Everyone was waiting, breathless, for her next words. She turned her gaze back to Miller, her eyes burning with an intensity that seemed to penetrate his very soul. He flinched, as if struck by a physical blow. She opened her mouth, and three words, spoken with a quiet, chilling certainty, a conviction that brooked no argument, shattered the meticulously constructed facade of Robert Miller's defense, and silenced the courtroom, leaving everyone stunned and reeling. "He told me." The words hung in the air, heavy and immutable, a devastating accusation that seemed to strip away all the legal maneuvering, all the carefully crafted arguments, all the layers of deception and doubt. The silence that followed was profound, a vacuum created by the sheer force of her statement. It was a silence broken only by the faint, almost imperceptible, hum of the fluorescent lights, a sound that suddenly seemed deafening. The impact of those 3 words was palpable, a seismic shift in the emotional landscape of the courtroom. The 3 words "he told me" hung in the air, vibrating with an almost physical force. The silence that followed wasn't merely the absence of sound. It was a vacuum, a void created by the sudden implosion of Robert Miller's carefully constructed world. The collective gasp of the courtroom was like the inrush of air after an explosion. Every eye was riveted on Emily Carter, the young woman who had, with those 3 simple words, detonated a bomb in the heart of the proceedings. Robert Miller, once the picture of confident defiance, now resembled a man who had aged decades in a matter of seconds. His skin had taken on a sickly, grayish pallor, and his eyes darted around the room unfocused, like those of a trapped animal. He opened his mouth several times as if trying to speak, but only a faint, strangled sound emerged. Sarah Chen, the legendary lawyer, the unflappable strategist, for the first time in her illustrious career, looked genuinely stunned. Her perfectly composed facade had cracked, revealing a flicker of something that might have been disbelief, even fear. Judge Thompson, a man who had presided over countless trials, who had seen and heard it all, gripped his gavel with white-knuckled intensity, his expression a mixture of shock and a strange kind of professional fascination. Emily Carter, however, remained remarkably calm, a small island of serenity in the swirling chaos she had unleashed. She stood tall, her slender frame radiating an unexpected strength, her fiery red hair a vibrant contrast to the muted tones of the courtroom. The courtroom security officers, caught in a moment of profound uncertainty, looked to Judge Thompson for direction, their hands hovering hesitantly near their tasers and handcuffs, unsure whether to restrain the young woman or to simply stand by and witness the unfolding drama. Judge Thompson, after what seemed like an eternity, finally regained his voice, though it was noticeably unsteady. "Ms. Carter, are you fully aware of the implications of what you are saying?" he asked, his voice a low rumble that barely carried across the courtroom. "You are under oath, young lady. Perjury is a very serious offense with severe consequences. Do you understand that?" He leaned forward, his gaze intense, trying to discern any hint of deception, any sign of hesitation in her demeanor. He needed to know, not just for the sake of the trial, but for the integrity of the entire judicial process, whether this was a genuine revelation or a calculated act of malice. Emily nodded slowly, her eyes meeting the judge's gaze without flinching. "Yes, Your Honor, I understand. I understand the gravity of the situation, and I am not lying. I swear on everything that is holy I am telling the truth. He told me. He told me everything. He confided in me." The conviction in her voice was undeniable, a raw, unfiltered honesty that resonated through the courtroom. A wave of murmurs, whispers, and gasps rippled through the gallery, like wind rustling through dry leaves. The journalists, their pens flying across their notepads, were capturing every detail, every nuance of this extraordinary moment. Their initial shock had given way to a frenzied excitement, the realization that they were witnessing a legal bombshell, a story that would dominate headlines for weeks to come. Amanda Chen, the head of R&D at Novatech, sat rigidly in her seat, her face a mask of barely suppressed triumph. Her lips were pressed into a thin, tight smile, and her eyes gleamed with a mixture of vindication and a cold, hard satisfaction. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the moment of reckoning for Robert Miller. Miller's family, on the other hand, was a picture of utter devastation. His wife, Eleanor, a woman who had always maintained a public image of grace and composure, now openly wept, her shoulders shaking with uncontrollable sobs. She buried her face in her hands as if trying to shield herself from the horrifying reality unfolding before her. Their two teenage children, a boy and a girl, looked utterly lost and confused, their faces pale and drawn. They stared at Emily with a mixture of fear, resentment, and a desperate, heartbreaking plea for this all to be a terrible nightmare. His elderly mother, her frail hands clutching a rosary, her lips moving in silent, fervent prayer, seemed to have shrunk in on herself, her eyes filled with a profound, unutterable sadness. Sarah Chen, ever the professional, recovered her composure with remarkable speed. She rose to her feet, her movements sharp and precise, her voice cutting through the rising tide of noise like a scalpel. "Your Honor," she declared, her voice ringing with authority, "I must object strenuously. This is highly irregular, to say the least. This witness, this Ms. Carter, has not been vetted. She has not been subjected to any form of discovery. We have absolutely no information about her background, her credibility, her potential biases. We have no context whatsoever for these extraordinary claims. This is clearly a deliberate attempt to derail these proceedings, a desperate, last-ditch effort by parties unknown, to influence the jury and sabotage Mr. Miller's defense." She cast a pointed, accusatory glance at Amanda Chen, subtly implying that Novitek might be behind this unexpected turn of events, that this was a carefully orchestrated plot to destroy her client. David Ramirez, the district attorney, sensing a golden opportunity, sprang to his feet, his voice brimming with righteous indignation. "Your Honor," he countered, his voice booming across the courtroom, "I vehemently disagree. Ms. Carter's testimony is not only relevant, it is potentially crucial to this case. If she possesses evidence, first-hand knowledge, that directly implicates the defendant in the crime he is accused of, we have a moral and legal obligation to hear it. Justice demands that we allow her to speak, that we hear her testimony in its entirety. To suppress this information would be a travesty, a miscarriage of justice." Judge Thompson, caught between the opposing arguments of two legal giants, held up his hands, palms open, in a gesture of appeasement. "Enough," he said, his voice firm and decisive, cutting through the escalating tension. "Ms. Chen, your objections are noted. Mr. Ramirez, your points are well taken. However, we must proceed with caution and adhere to due process. Ms. Carter," he said, turning his attention to the young woman, "you will approach the bench, and you will explain yourself. Clearly, concisely, and with complete honesty. You will tell us everything, and you will answer any questions we may have." Emily walked towards the bench, her steps measured and deliberate. She moved with a quiet grace, a surprising poise that belied her age and her relatively humble background. She seemed unfazed by the legal wrangling, by the intense scrutiny of the court, by the sheer weight of the responsibility that had suddenly been thrust upon her. She carried herself with a quiet dignity, a sense of purpose that suggested she was driven by something far deeper than mere attention-seeking or malice. As she reached the imposing mahogany bench, Judge Thompson leaned forward, his expression softening slightly, his voice taking on a more gentle, almost paternal tone. "Ms. Carter," he began, "please tell us in your own words who you are. What is your relationship to the defendant, Mr. Robert Miller? And what is it precisely that he allegedly told you?" Emily took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts, steeling herself for the ordeal ahead. She glanced briefly at Miller, who was now slumped in his chair, his head bowed, his body language radiating utter defeat. He looked like a broken man, a man who had lost everything. She then turned back to the judge, her gaze steady and unwavering. "My name is Emily Carter," she said, her voice clear and surprisingly strong, resonating through the hushed courtroom. "I'm 23 years old. I graduated from MIT last year with a degree in computer science. I was Mr. Miller's intern at Innovatech. I started working there 6 months ago." A collective gasp, a ripple of astonishment swept through the gallery. An intern. The notion that a lowly intern, a recent graduate, could possess information that could potentially bring down a corporate titan like Robert Miller was almost inconceivable. It was a David and Goliath scenario, a stark reminder that even the most powerful individuals could be vulnerable to the actions of those they deemed insignificant. "And what was the nature of your internship, Ms. Carter?" Judge Thompson inquired, his voice laced with curiosity. "What were your responsibilities?" I worked in the research and development department," Emily explained, "mostly on data analysis and algorithm optimization. I was assigned to Mr. Miller's team. He took an interest in me. He said I had potential." She hesitated, a flicker of pain crossing her features, a hint of the betrayal she felt. "And during the course of your internship, Mr. Miller confided in you about the alleged theft of Novatech's technology." Judge Thompson prompted, guiding her towards the crux of the matter. Emily nodded, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "Yes, he did. At first it was subtle. He would ask me questions about Novatech, about their security protocols, about their AI platform. He said he was impressed by their technology. He said he wanted to learn from them." She paused, taking another deep breath, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. But then it changed. He became obsessed. He started talking about how Novatech was a threat to Innovatech, how they were going to steal our market share, how we needed to fight back. And did he at any point explicitly state that he had stolen or intended to steal Novatech's intellectual property? Judge Thompson pressed. His eyes narrowed, focusing intently on Emily's every word, every subtle nuance of her expression. Emily hesitated again, her gaze flickering towards Miller. He was now looking directly at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pleading and despair. It was a look that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She swallowed hard, steeling her resolve. "Yes," she said, her voice firm and clear, the words ringing out in the silent courtroom. "Yes, he did. He told me everything. He showed me the stolen files. He bragged about how he had bypassed their security. He said it was easy. He said he was smarter than they were." The courtroom erupted. Shouts of outrage, gasps of disbelief, a cacophony of noise filled the air. drowning out even Judge Thompson's repeated banging of his gavel. It took several minutes, and the threat of clearing the courtroom for order to be partially restored. Sarah Chen was on her feet instantly, her voice rising above the din, sharp and incisive. "Your Honor, I object. This is outrageous. This is nothing but hearsay, unsubstantiated allegations, a blatant attempt to prejudice the jury against my client. This young woman is clearly a disgruntled employee with a personal vendetta against Mr. Miller. I demand a mistrial. This entire line of questioning is inadmissible." Ramirez, equally vehement, countered, "Your Honor, this is not hearsay. This is direct testimony from a witness who claims to have first-hand knowledge of the defendant's guilt. We cannot simply ignore this. This woman is risking everything to come forward and tell the truth. The jury has a right to hear her testimony. To deny them that right would be a miscarriage of justice." Judge Thompson, after a long, tense silence, his face a mask of judicial deliberation, made his ruling. "Ms. Chen," he said, his voice calm but firm, "your motion for a mistrial is denied. Ms. Carter's testimony, while certainly surprising and potentially prejudicial, is also potentially relevant. We cannot simply dismiss it out of hand. Ms. Carter," he said, turning his attention back to the young woman, "you will be allowed to continue your testimony. But," he added, his voice stern, "you will be subject to rigorous cross-examination by Ms. Chen, and you will be expected to provide specific details, concrete evidence, not just vague accusations and generalizations. Do you understand?" Emily nodded, her expression resolute. "Yes, Your Honor, I understand." She was sworn in, her hand trembling slightly as she placed it on the worn Bible, the weight of the oath settling upon her shoulders. Then, slowly, painstakingly, she began to tell her story. She described her initial excitement at being chosen to work on Miller's team. He was a legend in the tech world, a visionary, a man who had built a multi-billion-dollar empire from scratch. She had admired him, idolized him even. She had been eager to learn from him, to prove herself worthy of his attention. She recounted how he had gradually drawn her into his confidence, sharing his thoughts, his plans, his frustrations. He had flattered her, praised her intelligence, made her feel special, important. He had given her access to sensitive information, entrusted her with tasks that were far beyond her pay grade. She had at first been blinded by his charisma, by the thrill of being included in his inner circle. She described the late-night meetings in his office, the hushed conversations, the encrypted emails that she had been instructed to send and receive. She recounted how Miller had become increasingly fixated on Novatech's new AI-powered data analysis platform, a technology that was rumored to be years ahead of anything else on the market. He had seen it as a direct threat to Novatech's dominance, a potential game-changer that could topple his empire. Emily described how Miller had tasked her with researching Novatech's security protocols, exploiting her technical skills and her naive enthusiasm. He had framed it as a research project, a way to learn from the competition. She had, unknowingly, become his accomplice, helping him to identify vulnerabilities in Novatech's system, providing him with the information he needed to carry out his plan. She recounted the day Miller had finally broken through Novatech's security defenses. She described the triumphant grin on his face, the way he had boasted about his ingenuity, his ability to outsmart some of the best cybersecurity experts in the world. He had shown her the stolen files, the confidential documents, the proprietary source code. He had treated it like a game, a conquest, a victory over a rival. At first, Emily admitted she had been swept up in the excitement, impressed by Miller's brilliance, by the sheer audacity of his actions. But then, slowly, doubt had begun to creep in. She had started to question his methods, his ethics, his motivations. She had realized that she had been used, manipulated, drawn into a web of deceit. The guilt had become unbearable, a crushing weight on her conscience. She had considered going to the authorities, reporting Miller's actions, but fear had paralyzed her. He was a powerful man with vast resources and connections. She had worried about the repercussions, about the potential damage to her career, even about her physical safety. She had been afraid of becoming a target, of being silenced. But then she had seen Miller's family in the courtroom, their faces etched with pain and anguish. She had seen the devastating impact of his actions on their lives, the ripple effect of his greed and ambition. And she had known that she could no longer remain silent. She had realized that the truth, however painful, was more important than her own fears, her own self-preservation. As Emily spoke, the courtroom listened in rapt silence, hanging on her every word. Her testimony was detailed, specific, and utterly devastating. She provided names, dates, times, specific details about the stolen files, the methods used to access them, the individuals involved. She painted a picture of Robert Miller that was far more sinister, more calculating, more morally bankrupt than even the prosecution had depicted. He was not just a ruthless businessman willing to bend the rules. He was a criminal, a thief, a man who had betrayed his own employees, his shareholders, and the principles of fair competition. Sarah Chen, during her cross-examination, launched a ferocious attack on Emily's credibility. She was relentless, merciless, using every legal tactic at her disposal to discredit the young woman, to paint her as a liar, a fabricator, a disgruntled employee with a personal vendetta against Miller. She questioned her motives, her memory, her mental stability. She insinuated that she was romantically obsessed with Miller, that she had been spurned by him, that she was seeking revenge. "Isn't it true, Ms. Carter," Chen asked, her voice dripping with sarcasm, "that you were infatuated with Mr. Miller, that you had romantic feelings for him?" Emily blushed, but she held her ground. "No, that's not true. I admired him professionally, but I was never romantically involved with him." Chen pressed on, relentlessly. "Isn't it true, Ms. Carter, that you were passed over for a promotion, that you were resentful of Mr. Miller for not recognizing your talents?" "I was never promised a promotion," Emily replied, her voice steady. "I was an intern. I was there to learn." Chen produced emails that Emily had sent to friends, emails in which she had expressed frustration with her work, with the long hours, with the demanding nature of her job. She attempted to use these emails to portray Emily as a disgruntled employee, someone who was looking for a way to get back at her boss. But a new plot came out. One of the jurors, juror number 8, a middle-aged man, began to cough violently, and it was discovered he was poisoned. After investigations, it was discovered Miller had an accomplice on the jury. It all ended when all the proofs came together and Miller, seeing no way out, pleaded guilty and later sentenced.